Sony Interactive Entertainment presents a Naughty Dog game. These are words I've seen pop up time and time again over the years, projected brightly on my TV screen at home, and at gaming press events whose purpose was to not only advertise and generate interest among their potential consumer base, but also ignite the spark of hype culture so the anticipation for these now memorable titles could occur. That being said, the studio name and brand that's become detrimental to guaranteeing consumers to dedicate themselves to patience as they await the release of stupendously polished games could not spawn out of thin air overnight. Like anything, and anyone, they needed to start somewhere and maintain their presence as they continued to evolve and take things further and further with the video games they continued to develop for the PlayStation brand over the past 20 or so years. For myself, Naughty Dog is a studio that's taken me through many different adventures and many different stories throughout my life as a gamer. Though some of what they had to offer didn't interest me until much later, since admittedly back in the day, I was a bit too focused on an empty gap that probably never will be filled, even if they did try and just couldn't make it work even after, from what I can imagine, vigorous and conflicting discussion. I've learned to eventually let it go, but I do continue to hope and pray that one day it may return to the light and get the true continuation and recognition it deserves. Because, to be frank, I wasn't satisfied with what I saw in the PSP continuation created a decade ago by High Impact Games. Regardless of when I've experienced these games throughout my life, they've earned my respect and have proven time and time again their mastery, dedication, and appreciation to the craft of creating memorable video game experiences that I'll cherish for a lifetime. And as a gamer, I can definitely say that every time Naughty Dog makes an appearance to announce a new project, I'm always down to grab a slice of the action, become invested in their worlds, and listen to what they have to offer. This is where The Last of Us Part 2 comes in, marking Naughty Dog's third and final game they developed this generation in order to close it out with a bang, just like they did with the first Last of Us, as the next one gears up for its scheduled appearance later this year. This has been a long time coming, ever since the crowd attending 2016's PlayStation Experience event alongside gamers watching events unfold from home roared at the sight of a familiar insignia, red strand of hair alongside her familiar voice, and a familiar man, followed by his familiar voice that was then followed up by a familiar face and logo alongside a part 2. Then time continued to move forward as 2017's Paris Games event intrigued me with a conversation of new potential characters and the media's obsession of the game's explicit display of violence. With 2018, E3 showed us gameplay that gave us all a sense of how this game was further evolving to improve on what the first game had done mechanically and graphically. Then, 2019 and 2020 is where things began to get, interesting, as small seeds of doubt slowly creeped into my brain. I could respect and tolerate decisions such as delaying the game and taking out the multiplayer to focus on the game's single-player experience itself. However, those were tiny leaps compared to the big leaps that 2020 delivered, as, to put it lightly, a lot happened as there seemingly lacked an at-home demo release, an uncertain delay, followed by, and I won't bullshit you either since I'm sure we all know what I'm talking about, leaks that understandably made some gamers, myself included, momentarily express some anger towards Naughty Dog, as everyone collectively said, and I'll let Ellie take this one,
"What are you doing?"
Despite all the reasons to echo the rest of the crowd's sentiments to retract my pre-order for this game, I persistently decided that for my own sake, it was best to stay the course, get the game, and judge it after I played it myself, which Neil Druckmann seemed to believe as well, as he said, and I quote, "Nothing compares to playing this game from beginning to end. It's a video game. You have to play it." I'm uncertain if Neil is someone I like, but regardless, I still shared the same sentiments and did not wish to contribute and indulge in the already volatile atmosphere of the internet, so I continued to wait patiently. As the release date grew closer, my curiosity increased as I wanted to understand what they were trying to go for with this game, hence why I decided to go digging for a few articles logging what the developers or the actors have said about this game. I'm sure there's much more to the story, but from what I've found, it painted a clearer picture for me. This is a game about the theme of hate, whereas the first game was about love. This is a game where you're focused on playing as Ellie, which proved true for the most part. The second thing I'd say that jumped out at me is Naughty Dog preaching over and over again that this is their most ambitious title, which would also make it their longest game yet. The third I'd say mixes in with an interesting statement where they preach about this game deliberately making you feel uncomfortable as you play, citing that fun isn't the word they use, but instead they use the word engaging, while still preaching about the core theme of hatred that this game revolves around. So rating all of this is fine and dandy, but then we get to what I believe is one of the most interesting and poignant points I've heard, and it helped me clear my mind going into the game because Joel Miller's actor himself, Troy Baker, mentioned that he was uncertain as to whether or not people would like the game, though he was confident in people not feeling any ambivalence towards the game. Connecting the dots with that point is that he's also gone on record to tell people that this game will make you question everything you know about The Last of Us, be it the world, the characters, etc. And across the board, he encouraged people to go into the game with an open mind, since with a closed one, it'd be a completely different experience. So, keeping these sorts of perspectives revealed by the developers in mind, my interest for the game surprisingly grew stronger as I resisted any remaining temptation to eradicate any interest for this game because of what got leaked. I echoed Tommy in the first game as he prepared to lean back in a chair to give Joel his full attention to let him explain his journey with Ellie. I simply thought to myself and spoke as if the developers were in the room with me, and firmly said, despite me believing that I was going to hate this game, to say, "Alright, I'll bite. I accept your challenge, Naughty Dog." Finally, with all that being said, did The Last of Us Part 2 and Naughty Dog, like their games before, woo me as it chimed an ingenious melody that I couldn't help but smirk and smile at? Or did it all crash and burn as I rejected its repulsiveness that left me feeling an overabundance of anguish and betrayal? Let's discuss. Despite Naughty Dog's reputation currently being sealed as a game developer that captivates audiences with their phenomenal storytelling, character work, voice acting direction, and photorealistic graphics, to me, that doesn't mean that the discussion of their gameplay formulas is considered less important. A notable distinction that The Last of Us Part 1 provided in comparison to their previous works is turning away from the traditional third-person action-adventure style of play that Uncharted and, to a lesser extent, Jak and Daxter, provided players. Rather than jumping far distances from platform to platform, harnessing powerful elements, climbing giant landmarks, or running and gunning in a fast-paced, aggressive, and empowered fashion while being aware of your surroundings and different gameplay options based on what you're playing. That type of empowerment has instead been replaced with a sense of vulnerability with The Last of Us as a whole in the post-apocalyptic world of Parts 1 and 2. With a slower, delicate, and calculated style of play, the plentiful amount of ammo and weapons available to you like candy, in addition to health regeneration and heroic, out-of-this-world, sometimes terrifying, power, are completely absent. Instead, the game is in favor of limited resources that prompt you to not only have more of an urgency to make your shots count, but also connect with the weapons you saddle up on your shoulders, since you're not constantly rotating them out of your inventory in favor of another weapon dropped by a downed enemy. Now yes, in Uncharted's case, it depended on what gun you carried, since some weapons had more ammo available for them versus others. In those games, you can relatively get away with battling the enemy head-on, as opposed to stealthily taking them out, but The Last of Us Part 2, like its predecessor, requires extensive thinking and carefully planned out moves, since charging straight into situations isn't the wisest course of action to take when stealth, evasion, accuracy, and ammo conservation is preferred most of the time. I say most of the time since you can shoot your way out of a situation if you'd like to, though what may cross a player's mind in that moment before taking that approach is, do I have enough to tackle the current situation, and will I have enough for future situations? And coming back to resources for a second, taking more than just bullets into account is something I've grown fond of in games from both past and present survival horror titles that I appreciate, which is one of the reasons, besides the memorable story and characters, I'd gotten attached to the original. Resources, supplements, craftable recipes, upgrades, and new potential skill sets are all available for not only the weapons saddled up in your inventory, but also characters you take control of throughout the game, granting them access to resources that were previously unobtainable, which in turn grants the player with more options to approach different situations. Everything that's available, resource-wise, though they'd have to be found first, would be familiar to a player who's played through the first game. Molotovs, bombs, health packs, melee upgrades, etc. are all here and accounted for. Each situation will vary from time to time, and it's up to an individual to either stock up on deadly tools that could either rip others to shreds and set them ablaze, or heal themselves so they can endure and survive close and ranged encounters more effectively to further progress. This is something I'll discuss a little later, but items such as the Shiv, in addition to new items such as incendiary shells, aren't items available when you first play as Ellie, and the same goes for other weapons. There are some similarities with what character carries what item, both old and new, but I'll dive into that aspect later and instead go over the few small additions added into the gameplay loop. Infiltrating the structure of The Last of Us Part 2's gameplay is a tiny fraction of Uncharted's DNA bleeding into the formula. Jumping, going prone, dodging, and additional means of stealth and traversal aren't all original gameplay additions, since I've seen it in games many times before, including in some of Naughty Dog's. All of this isn't a bad thing, mind you. As a matter of fact, nearly all of them add an additional layer of maneuverability, which feeds into these additions, enhancing a player's style of play, thus resulting in them having access to additional options while the game maintains the core identity of what kind of game it is. Now, I know this may sound redundant, but when I play a Last of Us game, I expect it to feel like a Last of Us game. And that's something they're able to accomplish despite borrowing a small fraction of DNA from their more bombastic and adventurous counterparts. Despite some of those elements bleeding into one another from their past projects, I believe they do it well here in this game without it manifesting as an Uncharted 4.5 but with zombies of sorts. Moving along from what the player can do to defend and maintain themselves, I wanted to briefly discuss another topic, the open world. Besides some of The Last of Us Part 2's open world sections serving as a successor to the potential being displayed in the first Last of Us's University of Eastern Colorado level, there are other games in Naughty Dog's catalog, released both before and after The Last of Us Part 1, developed with open world elements to varying degrees. However, outside of their games, the difference between The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 is a bit more reminiscent of the open-world survival horror game elements featured in The Evil Within 2, and how that game, as a result of its inclusion, differentiates itself from its original counterpart. The Evil Within and The Last of Us both couldn't be more different in terms of style, but I found it interesting to notice that both of their original titles began as relatively linear experiences, featuring very small detours you can potentially miss on your first playthrough. But when I think about what to do when placed in these open world areas featured in both The Evil Within 2 and The Last of Us Part 2, I think about what's at stake, where I'm actually supposed to go, and think about if that's the urgent move I want to make immediately. Sure, I could go to the main objective first, necessary for main story progression, but if I did, I'd probably miss out on a ton of stuff like resources, collectibles, notes, additional conversations and scenes, and even weapons. I'm pretty sure that in this game, I missed out on a lot of things, despite exploring as thoroughly as I could in my first playthrough, but that's besides the point. Being able to explore a big open world is an addition I appreciate, since not only does it feel rewarding when finding these additional resources that probably wouldn't have been obtained if not for the exploration, but it's also great to have since I have a lot more time to thoroughly explore every nook and cranny due to the real-life global pandemic. Some sections of the game are much more linear than others, but in the end, I'd say it was worth the trouble.
What are you doing?
This my shit. All the girls stomp your feet like this.
That's so dumb.
I'll touch a bit more on this soon, but during my progression and exploration, I tended to get lost and marvel at how fantastic the game looks from top to bottom, as it makes use of the graphical capabilities and engine that both Uncharted 4 and Uncharted Lost Legacy utilize to bring this game to life in a way that only a Last of Us game uniquely could. But before I take that discussion any further, I think it'd be best to quickly highlight another thing that contributes to The Last of Us Part 2's engaging gameplay experience: sound design. First, let's begin with the guns. At the time of my first playthrough, hearing that was a great first impression and allowed me to joyfully brace myself for what I was getting into long before I encountered a single enemy. In collaboration with every weapon fulfilling different purposes and having appropriately different kickbacks and feels to each of them during combat, there's no shortage of great sound design on every single weapon. I won't cover all of them, but a few of my personal favorites come from the pinpoint accurate, devastating echoes of the rifle's cartridges, the thundering blast of the shotgun's spread, and hell, even the starting pistol sounds like it packs a punch, despite being one of the weakest weapons among your inventory. Now for something that's on the exact opposite of beautifully put together gun sounds, but still remains beautiful, beautifully horrifying, in its own way. Like my discussion on resources and gameplay options, both old and new, The Last of Us Part 2 brings back enemies you'd remember encountering and fighting in the original, while offering a lot more in terms of what types of infected you can encounter. And when I say a lot more, I mean a lot more. Like seriously. Damn. Meanwhile, with the original members of the infected family, the runners, stalkers, clickers, and bloaters, all of them improve on what made them a menacing and memorable threat in the first place. Combined with them acting much more aggressively and at times differently compared to the first game, which would prompt a player to adapt based on all of the controls and resources they have at their disposal. It's great that the sound design contributes to that unnerving feeling when hearing them clicking, murmuring, shouting, and even roaring nearby as they prepare to gush out a deadly attack. With all of that finally covered, let's quickly go over the game's visuals and art direction. Phenomenal work has gone into making every stage distinct as a way of contributing to the representation of how different groups of human settlements carry on with their lives, how they live and operate, what they believe in, what their capabilities are like, etc. In addition, with the world of The Last of Us revolving around a post-apocalyptic setting featuring the remnants of what people in that world remember as the old world, those remnants of society that serve as a reminder of the cataclysmic collapse people experienced due to the beginning of the cordyceps outbreak are now shown to be, like the first game, littered with the infected as opposed to a thriving, urbanized civilization and vast human population. Despite the abominable ugliness that exists within the world for the sole purpose of chewing you up, eating you alive, and spitting you back out, there's beauty to be found within these remnants of society from rundown, unkempt buildings, settlements, and houses consumed by natural elements such as snow, overgrown vegetation, and excessive flooding combined with unforgiving weather conditions. Though I stated it moments ago, and even as I sit here reading out my script into the microphone as I think about the game, it's awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping, and breathtaking how gorgeous this game is graphically. When combined with gameplay and what's at stake within each level, all the art direction and lighting effectively contributes to the unique feeling that Naughty Dog puts you in when getting you invested in the character's survival, their story, and what's happening around them. It also helps that well-directed, dedicated cast members harmoniously contributed to an engaging, blood-guzzling, eye-opening, adrenaline-pumping, bittersweet story on how the cycle of violence not only fuels and ignites the flames of vengeance within a person, but also how that slowly begins to sabotage and affect not only their own physical and mental apparatus, but those they love and care for as well. When attempting to digest the experience of The Last of Us Part 2's story, it's expected that one would get lost in thought as they attempt to solidly grasp on what's occurring or what has occurred on screen. I know I have. And for a while, The digestive process was painfully gut-wrenching. As of now, it's been 2 months since both my first playthrough and the game's release, and I managed to move past the initial confusion and disorientation that stormed within my head as a result of the experience's aftermath. But since the storm has peacefully been quelled, my mind restoring balance and solace once more, I believe I'm finally ready to explain what I've been able to get out of this game personally. It may not be something you agree with, but it's a takeaway that helped me deepen my connection and understanding with this game as I aim to find peace within its purposefully designed, unforgiving, and conflicting barrage of turmoil. Crafting a sequel to a beloved video game that's rightfully earned its iconography is no easy task, and the same can be said for other pieces of media since gambles are locked in place as the risk and reward sometimes flows in favor of a sequel that surpasses its original counterpart in almost every way, or... yeah, I'll let Joel take this one.
See, there's a sequel. Wasn't as good.
That being said, as far as I'm concerned, in the eyes of many fans both before and after this game's release, no matter what Naughty Dog tried to do with this game, and no matter the ambition they held for it, The Last of Us Part 1 sat tightly glued to a pedestal that shadowed over The Last of Us Part 2's inevitable struggle against not only its predecessor, but the previously mentioned outings that wowed many players this generation. While still believing in the vision they'd sought out for this game, I think during its 6-year development, internalized panic ran rampant within the minds of the developers as they feared retaliation from their most loyal of fans.
We joke around in the office like, this is the downfall of Naughty Dog. Throughout this entire game, we said, this is the downfall of Naughty Dog.
This is gonna bring us down, but what a way to go.
At this point in time, you may be sitting there rightfully asking, so what did you get out of this game? What makes it an unforgiving and conflicting barrage of turmoil? Let's go back to the beginning, or rather, the beginning of the end. As you may know, it all started as a simple drop-off from Boston's Fedra-controlled quarantine zone to the outskirts of the city since the Queen of the Fireflies, Marlene, fell back on her former soldier's word that his brother was reliable enough to help her if she was ever caught in a jam, though not everything's all that simple. Is it? Regardless, it was yet another smuggling job in return for a decent cache of firearms that were unrightfully traded away by an associate that owed the Fireflies despite being in their debt, which is a move that Joel and Tess were unhesitant to express their grievances upon. The job was slightly different since admittedly the pair never had to deal with smuggling a human before, but it was a job that neither Tess nor Joel backed down from since they were desperate for its perks and cared not for what circumstances or stories brought them together. From there, many things happened, as a reluctant detour not only proved the legitimacy of something both Joel and Tess previously thought was impossible, but it would be the beginning of a journey that Joel and Ellie would take across the United States that eventually ended at the Firefly-controlled Salt Lake City's St. Mary's Hospital. Both faced many insurmountable, life-changing horrors and challenges together, often having to bear the burden of not only each other as their connection deepened in confrontational and wholesome ways, but what and who's been sacrificed along the way. In the end, Joel served his purpose, and Ellie was unknowingly getting prepared to serve hers as a very close potential for the answer that the Fireflies have been chasing for years, a way to potentially bring humanity back to its former glory by finally being able to develop a vaccine to counter the infection that scarred the entire world for the past 2 decades. Joel, however, wasn't done, and refused to stand by as he, like before, witnessed somebody he considered a daughter-like figure fade away into the clutches of death's hands. For these past 7 years, that unrevoked decision that sealed the deal for what makes the first Last of Us so memorable has continued to spark debate in the present day. I'm only scratching the surface of what I've seen over the years, but some questions range from, was he right to do what he did, or was he wrong and selfish? Would Ellie have really wanted to do the surgery? Was it his fault that humanity is still doomed, or was there even a guaranteed cure at all to begin with? Even then, would it even be possible to mass produce? And would humanity accept reverting back to the ways things were 20 years prior? Furthermore, were there going to be any consequences for his decision? Despite many Firefly soldiers being gunned down, in addition to losing their queen, the first and second game helped to put the pieces together, saying that a handful were still alive, and we are shown how those surviving members had to bear the burden of their fallen comrades, friends and family alike. And as for Ellie and Joel, well, in order to go forward feeling content to begin their new lives in Jackson, it had to start with a lie. That lie mostly worked for a while, and the game does explore that aspect too. But like what remained of the Fireflies, that lie was rooted in how it was going to challenge both Joel and Ellie's relationship. However, it doesn't start there, nor does it maintain a chronological, airtight structure that the first game had, which in turn requires a slight amount of heavy lifting to put the pieces of this chaotically structured story together in a cohesive manner. But to kick off this story is an introduction to what Joel and Ellie's new life in Jackson looks like, and jumps ahead 4 years later into the future. Things are relatively stable for the most part, as their lives now have structure and order as dedicated community members protecting Jackson's borders. That is, until unfortunate and upsetting predicaments begin to occur. As a result of these hard-to-swallow occurrences, a new journey for Ellie, and many other characters both old and new, alongside her, begins. A journey that we, the player, guide as we experience what they experience. Though they wish to paint this journey as a way of pursuing justice for the injustice they'd recently endured, hatred and revenge guide their hand, as they seek out those responsible for these injustices, which is a mindset that, unknown to them at the time for both Team Jackson and the audience, influenced not only the ones they give chase to, but the war between two factions they're caught between as a result of their unresolved injustices they believe were bestowed upon one another. So the first thing we'll start with is the most omnipresent concept of the story, Ellie's journey for revenge. Understanding her attachment to Joel as a player who's played as and bonded with these characters these past 7 years, I naturally became invested in her journey to avenge him and his rather cruel and unfair death. Hell, to quote the man himself,
I know you wish things were different. I wish things were different. But they ain't.
And a few things that branched off from that question were a couple of thoughts. If any remaining Fireflies wanted to avenge their fallen comrades, either Joel or Jackson would pay the price, the latter of which came true. Regardless, Ellie's natural way of life, similar to Nathan Drake, coming out of retirement for one last treasure hunt in Uncharted 4, is disrupted as she obsesses over the goal to kill Joel's murder. And just like Nathan Drake, she initially has friends who support her 110% on her journey. However, as alluded to earlier, her obsession starts to eat away at not only herself, but her friendships as she becomes more distant with them throughout both her descent and the blood she spills. However, given this world's context, in addition to the character, Nathan Drake in Uncharted 4 was never this harsh despite showing a bit of frustration when the time came. But since this is The Last of Us Part 2, despite trying to put the pieces together to get an understanding as to why Abby killed Joel, her goal remained unchanged and killing her was the only thing that mattered. As such, these are things that Ellie said or expressed as a result. It's my way or the highway. I don't care if you die. Oh, you're pregnant and you can't pull your own weight anymore? You're a burden now. To add on top of that, not before paving through the infected and enemy battalions, there's every single press square to kill sequence when finding those who can lead her to Abby, which at times really displays her admiration for Joel and his methods for squeezing information out of others in the past, since she looked up to him as both a father and a teacher. Sometimes, throughout these sequences, despite the characters offering their best support because they care for Ellie, just like me, we all try our best to persistently hold on to that support for her, despite the seeds of doubt, which continues to tighten its grip, as sometimes, when all is said and done, my reaction ends up being, holy fuck, Ellie. To help break up the often suffocating action, however, are flashbacks during different points in Ellie's life when Joel was still among the living, which in addition I welcome since it serves as a great break since, just like Ellie, we can remember more positive moments they shared, though the feelings of tension and discomfort eventually catch up just like Ellie's present-day journey in Seattle. But as a way of displaying these flashbacks in the game, we get to remember Joel further, and we get to see many more sides to him within the flashbacks that take place days and even years prior to his unfortunate demise, and how he's changed compared to the first game. I think long before these flashbacks, the first impression of getting a sense of how Joel changed was the tiny gameplay sequence of taking control of him as we strung notes on a guitar, eventually leading him to sing Future Days to Ellie. Side note, I didn't talk about it at all in my gameplay section of this video, but it's been kind of amazing to see what people have done with the guitar in this game whenever the opportunity arose. Here, let me show you one of my favorites, courtesy of the folks at VG247.com. Unlike the more stoic and serious survivor I remember from the first game, Joel in the past feels a lot more laid back and at times will make a few quips and jokes, contributing to the fatherly bond that he shares with Ellie, which ties into how much things have changed. Since I remember a Joel that almost literally wanted nothing to do with her at times in the beginning, but with every opportunity the two had together, Ellie, under Joel's wing, not only taught and showed her many things such as, but not limited to, playing the guitar, but their teamwork and bond shine brightly as they continue to survive the infected while going through their patrol routines serving to protect Jackson. Though in my opinion, the museum flashback has to be one of my favorites of all the flashbacks I've seen in this game. It's very Left Behind-like, where the gameplay, apart from the DLC switching to Ellie in that present searching for supplies for a then injured Joel, doesn't revolve around combat but instead relies much more on the cast's performances. It's simple, doesn't require that much strategic thought compared to the main game when in the thick of it, since all you have to do here is walk, click button, and just experience and listen. Plus, it's remarkably wholesome, especially since, like Left Behind's section where Ellie plays through quote-unquote the turning, she, with the help of a cassette tape Joel gifts her for her birthday, containing the audio of Apollo 11's 1969 launch, helps to really bring out that powerful imagination that helps her envision what these things feel like. Now, there is a flashback that follows the exact gameplay philosophy to a T, and has the exact opposite effect compared to the wholesome museum level, but there is still combat within another that showcases Joel's role as a protector of Ellie, which is something I didn't expect since I thought I'd be walking away with the image in my head of Joel going down. Actually, thinking about that for a second, it's kinda jarring that these two scenes are in the same game, but regardless, moving on to discuss something that, besides what's next on after, makes The Last of Us Part 2 feel like Part 2 and 3 fused together at times, is the return to St. Mary's Hospital. This is where Ellie and Joel's relationship takes a somber turn. In the same hallway we remember running down to save her in the ending of the first game, Ellie, now walking the same hallway, finds what remained of the Fireflies after they left a bunch of gear behind. It took a tape recorder left behind to disprove that lie that Joel told her in the first game. She'd accepted for years that Joel was telling the truth with regards to many people being immune. Doubts within her mind, however, were close behind at the time. As the truth reluctantly came out, their relationship shattered, and it's kind of a shame since for a while I thought their final days were spent being separated. In addition, it feels like the efforts we put in while controlling Joel to save her almost feels unappreciated and unwelcomed. To be fair, I understand why Ellie reacts this way, to an extent, but it doesn't make it hurt any less at the time, and the wound only deepens when combining that with the fact that Ellie does the same thing to her friend during her journey. With that, it's finally time to talk about, to the best of my ability, yet another mixed element that makes the game feel like a Part 2 and 3. Abby Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Now, to start things off, Abby had already taken a journey of revenge just like Ellie. Unlike Ellie's 3-day journey, however, Abby's lasted for 4 years. When the game turns back the clock during a climactic incident that only picks up until much later, we go back in time to the day that Joel arrives with Ellie at St. Mary's Hospital. From there, minus the manipulation that somewhat exists here and throughout her present-day arc, while re-exploring old questions as it bridges the connection between the first and second game by tying one scene here to another in the first game. It momentarily brings back Marlene to show how conflicted she was with her best surgeon, Abby's father, on the proposal to kill Ellie for a vaccine, despite her being insistent on it when the time came to tell Joel.
She's a child, not some petri dish.
You think I don't... I'm aware of the situation.
And you're okay with killing her.
If this was your daughter, what would you do?
In retrospect, while I did harbor suspicions at the time with the first game, with Marlene feeling at odds, despite her showing an insistence that making a vaccine from Ellie was the right thing to do, it felt like a tiny eureka moment to put 2 and 2 together. But, as we all know, that's not how it ends. And in turn, this is what fuels Abby's vengeance for the next 4 years, as she eventually gets what she wants by avenging the Fireflies and her father's death by killing Joel. As I stated before, it's upsetting to know that Joel went out like this, and I didn't bring it up before, but what makes it even more upsetting is that Joel saved her life. But I guess in that moment, it didn't matter. Joel was still that murder that, in her mind, she needed to kill to finally get justice for the injustices she believed was bestowed upon her. Anyway, getting a glimpse from Abby's point of view solidifies something. Abby's face after dealing the final blow almost reads a sense of, I did it. I finally did it. So why am I not happy? Why aren't things better? On the contrary, things only get worse around her as her friends start to fight, and that was only the beginning for her. Another thing I found interesting within that second point of view of that scene is Ellie's cries in the background. When hearing her plead not to kill Joel, I think she finally understood, albeit too late, what Joel meant to another person, which makes me question if she'd have acted differently if Ellie was with Joel instead of Tommy. While on that topic, I wonder what would have happened had Joel not gone on that rampage and everyone was still alive. I personally doubt that she'd have gotten all of that muscle in the present. Not that I have an issue with Abby having that, since Naughty Dog had already developed female characters with some lean muscle on them, though Abby's is a little more exaggerated than them, which in hindsight might be the point. She wanted strength, but possibly overdid it, as evidenced by her making comments on how she gets sore often, and she seems to, on occasion, rub the back of her neck. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. She's been there before. She's pleaded for her dead father when she walked into that surgery room to find his corpse, but at that point in time, she's already gone too far to turn back. This is where I feel the game delivers that initial message that vengeance isn't a good thing, it only makes things worse, which does make me think about Ellie's journey as well, and the regrets I imagine she held because she can only remember how she pushed Joel away. And with the context of Ellie earlier commenting on how her and Joel were going to watch a movie together that night.
What are you doing tonight? I was thinking of inviting Joel to watch a movie.
Oh. You guys good?
Yeah.
Abby took away that chance to reconnect. I say that now, since saying revenge is bad was a conclusion I thought was underwhelming for the game's ending, but it suited things a little better here. Now yes, it does exist when we get to that point, but there's something beyond that I want to save for later. So, where does this leave Abby in the present? Well, she's one of the Washington Liberation Front's top members that's been a great asset into wiping out their enemies, the Seraphites. However, despite her strength and her skill, in addition to more firepower she wields compared to Ellie's reserved loadout, it doesn't make her 100% invincible, or a one-woman army, nor does it cancel out her fears when she's confronted by them, both within her own mind and what she'd have to face despite her entire body screaming, "Fuck this, I want out." Which leads me to Yara and Lev, two runaway Seraphite members rebelling against their traditions, trying to look for a way out. Intersecting with Abby, they, though it's not as charming as Ellie and Joel, eventually contribute to Abby's healing process, in addition to regaining her lost humanity while possibly seeking some form of quote-unquote redemption. This leads me back to what I referred to regarding manipulation. Ever since the beginning, I've had very negative reactions towards Abby. Let's keep this in mind as well. I had negative reactions towards Abby, not Laura Bailey. I persistently held on to a hatred for her, but over time, that hatred, despite me trying to hold on to that persistently, almost somewhat fades away into support, thus somewhat mirroring an opposite turnaround with what I felt for Ellie in this game. Compared to Ellie, however, though one could say this could be me embodying Ellie, With all the good Abby does in this game, a tiny voice screams within me saying, remember what she did. And though it doesn't contain the subtlety that Joel had when justifying his actions as a survivor, the game somewhat amplified that tiny voice to remind me what she was really like. And depending on the individual, you either agree or disagree.
You're a piece of shit, Abby. You always have been.
As interesting and engaging as some of these stages can get, sometimes it feels a bit weighed down due to the flashbacks, in addition to a bit too much going on, slowing down the pace. Now yes, in theory, it can let me anticipate what's going to happen next just before that cutout, but when it all happens too often, the momentum in the pacing being botched makes putting the pieces together with how Abby's story intersects with and complements Ellie's somewhat of a misery at first. When barely given time to breathe, and this is a problem I found with both Ellie and Abby's story, though some characters are an exception, it sometimes doesn't give me a proper outlet for bonding with these characters like I feel I should have. As such, whenever I think back to or witness their demise, I can't extract a strong reaction due to the lacking connection I felt. Don't get me wrong, there is something there, but something is missing. It doesn't quite hit the mark, despite it pivoting the story to where it needs to go. And since I brought up Ellie and Abby's stories intersecting, this has to be one of the most mind-boggling and challenging boss fights I've ever felt in gaming. I'm not fighting some monster or abomination. I'm not fighting some crazy merc leader. And the fight itself is not even that hard. I'm fighting somebody I love, which in itself is conflicting since the last I've seen this style of a boss fight in The Last of Us's world was with David, somebody I actually wanted to fight against. But as for this fight, some of the reactions I remember when playing it through consisted of the following. Hey, isn't that my pistol I've been using all this time? That's the bow and arrow I upgraded myself. I know that red dot sight. Holy shit, that's my shotgun. Why is all my hard work shooting back at me? I'm sorry, Ellie, I don't want to do this. But if I don't do this, I can't progress. Oh, never mind. Is it over? Nope. Now, I want to say, as every fiber of my being almost doesn't want to partake in it, I can't say I'd blame Abby, nor can I blame Ellie. Regardless of what I said about those characters, Abby is trying to avenge them in this fight. Though I'm cheering more for the actual boss itself, because a couple companions of theirs I cared for a bit more than the other guys went down. It's definitely true that one violent act spirals out of control into another violent act, but then it keeps going and going and going until somebody is brave enough to stand up to say that enough is enough, which is a role that Lev filled, though that doesn't exactly last. So where does this leave Ellie and the rest of her friends? Turns out that something Ellie and Dina talked about while in Seattle, getting a farm, is something that came true when they got back to Jackson. They can live a normal life, and yes, I can easily compare this entire section to Uncharted 4 yet again, since there is a slight resemblance to that game's house section. But things are really different here in terms of execution. Stable isn't exactly what I'd call this new life, despite things going smoothly as Ellie takes a parental role for the child of her fallen friend, Jesse. There are still many forms of interference that prevents this from going as smoothly as it could, as Ellie's inability to talk about and cope with her trauma regarding Joel's death that sometimes manifests in violent ways, to a now crippled Tommy whose marriage seems to be in limbo, while also pressuring Ellie to go after Abby herself in his place. Like with anything in this game, it's really sad to see Tommy become this former shadow of who he was. Can I blame him for it? No, especially since I imagine that somewhere deep down, he blames himself for his brother's death, since he was the one that gave out their names in the first place. It's all a big game of could've or should've, which is a thought I had as well when it came to balancing out the playtimes between Ellie and Abby. With that, I think it's finally time to talk about that ending. Initially, I thought this ending was somewhat underwhelming, and I think a majority of the fanbase agreed as well. But as 2 months have passed, a few factors did help me make peace with this admittedly bittersweet ending. In my mind, despite being slightly more content with Abby at this point, part of me still held onto that contempt I possessed for her in the beginning of the game. So when karma caught up to her, I thought to myself, yeah, doesn't feel good being held up against your will, does it? Though it kinda sucked that Lev had to be caught up in that. Joel, without a doubt, suffered in his vital moments. So Ellie, upon reaching the pillars after many hard final stretches, finding Abby in that dreadful condition, appearing beaten and broken, and having lost all of that muscle, possibly due to a lack of nourishment from her captors, I'd say she'd gotten what she deserved at that point. She suffered enough. However, as Abby, Lev, and Ellie get ready to leave, the tiny voice in my head I mentioned earlier starts to take over simultaneously with Ellie's thoughts. Now, I promise you this is the final time I beat this comparison into the ground, but this final, admittedly reluctant fight that takes us into the game's credits is almost like a colder version of Uncharted 4's. Unlike that game's fiery set piece carrying the mood of going mano to mano for the glory, escaping with their lives, and Henry Avery's treasure, this fight is just dark and depressing. Revenge is best served cold, as they say. The game communicates that distinct feeling really well, from the somber music to the fact that Ellie and Abby both sound and look really exhausted, to them being surrounded by a fog on the beach. Side note, but it's kind of funny that Nate and Abby, respectively, are the ones who refuse to fight. Meanwhile, Ellie and Rafe are the ones that initiate it. So in Uncharted 4's case, we're fighting back in defense, while in this game, we take on the role as the aggressor and initiator. So you'd think this is where Ellie will finally do it. She'll finally avenge the man that she, as well as we, loved. But something different happens. She doesn't go through with it. Thinking back to Joel while suffocating the life out of Abby, she gets off of her and tells Abby to just go. In retrospect, it finally allows Ellie to start the healing process. And as we learned from Abby killing Joel, it didn't bode well for her since vengeance is not only pointless, but also doesn't help improve things. I can imagine that Ellie would have gone through the same thing had she left Abby under the water longer. And as we learned from Lev, it takes a brave step to stop the cycle once and for all, which is a step that Ellie was able to take as well, so she can retrace her steps back home. So as Ellie travels back to the now abandoned farm as a final home stretch to the credits, which by the way, I don't think Dina's bracelet on her arm, or her not being surprised that Dina is gone, is an error of sort. The final takeaway for me is, though I understand it will be very different for many individuals out there, when it comes to family, if you care deeply for them, you have to appreciate every single moment with them, since you never know what time can do. You never know when and if the next day will be another chance to spend time with them. So if you push them away or seal yourself off from them, you may live to regret it like Ellie did. And as mentioned by Riley back in Left Behind, there's a million ways we could die today or tomorrow. But while we still can, we can fight for all the time we can spend with our loved ones. And as for Ellie's stolen missing parts, she's no need for them anymore. By placing that guitar in the windowsill, a beloved gift from Joel she cherished for years, Ellie's found the strength to keep moving forward. By finally shedding off her guilt and regrets, while finding the strength to say one final goodbye to Joel as she walks away from the farmhouse. And again, judging from what I pointed out, I'd say her and Dina can move forward together as prominent community members living prosperous and stable lives in Jackson. And as for Abby and Lev, well, judging by the New Game Plus loading screen, after completing the game for the first time, maybe they found their salvation too. In conclusion, The Last of Us Part 2 was not what I was expecting at all. Now yes, Naughty Dog promised an uncomfortable game, and that's exactly what we got. As said in the beginning, I went into this game somewhat tainted with the doubt and anger that the rest of the internet shared when the game got leaked. But overall, despite some weak areas previously mentioned, and the fact that this game could have been 2 games instead of 1, I'd say this was a very unique experience. It improved on the original's gameplay, while trying many different unexpected things, foregoing the typical crowd-pleasing moments, despite some of that existing within the final product. Despite me liking this game, however, I can completely understand where people come from when they say that this game doesn't work for them at all. I'm also open to the notion that maybe with time, I won't like this game. But as it stands today, from my personal experience, I'm really glad I didn't cancel my pre-order and got to experience this game from top to bottom. Honestly, my only regret now, just like the first game, is I wish I could experience the whole game for the first time again. Now, as for what awaits us in the future, well, maybe Naughty Dog or other game developers themselves can take this ambition this game had and improve on it to continue pushing things forward. I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations of what worked and what didn't work so we can allow for future growth and improvements. Other than that, I've got nothing else to say. Well everyone, that's going to be all from me today. This was a longer video than I thought it was going to be, but either way, I'm glad I got this done before a nice needed vacation before school starts up again. Before I go, let me know down in the comments what you liked or disliked about this video, The Last of Us Part 2 itself, anything. I'm open to any sort of feedback since this was my first game review I'd done in a few years, so I think in time, I'll continue to build on the skills I have. I will admit starting things off with a game like The Last of Us Part 2 was a difficult task, but I'm proud of the results that came from the work I put into this video. Who knows, in the scenario of a re-review, maybe I do better then, but only time will tell. I just have to be patient since I'm always still learning. So, as always, thank you for watching all the way through. Please take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.